March 1944. Over Berlin, the sky should have belonged to the Luftwaffe. 400 German fighters rose to annihilate an outnumbered American escort. By every rule of air combat, it should have been a massacre. Instead, it became the day Germany's Air Force never recovered, and the Mustang proved who would own the skies. March 1944. High above Berlin, the sky filled with engines. Hundreds of German fighters clawed their way upward to meet the intruders. By the numbers alone, the outcome seemed obvious. 400 Luftwaffe aircraft versus just 262 American escort fighters deep inside the Reich, far from home, fuel already ticking away. By every rule of air combat, this should have been a slaughter. The Luftwaffe believed this was their moment. Berlin was not just another target. It was the heart of the Reich, a symbol that could not be allowed to burn in daylight. Orders were simple and brutal. Launch everything. Veteran pilots barely trained replacements. Aging Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs all rose together in a desperate attempt to destroy the American force before it reached the capital. Inside the American cockpits, the tension was suffocating. Oxygen masks pressed tight against frozen faces. Hands trembled on throttles despite layers of gloves. These pilots knew the odds. They knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew this was the moment they had trained for. This was the test that would decide whether their new fighter was just another aircraft or the key to survival. What followed was not simply another air battle. It was a violent collision of doctrine, technology, and human endurance at 20,000 feet. A single day that tore the core out of Germany's air defenses. And when the smoke finally cleared, one question echoed across the war in Europe. How did the Luftwaffe lose so much so fast on this one day over Berlin? As the American formations pushed deeper into Germany, the air grew heavier with anticipation. At 20,000 feet, contrails stitched the sky into long white scars, marking every movement. The bombers droned forward in rigid formation, while the Mustangs prowled above and beside them, scanning constantly. Every pilot knew this altitude favored speed, energy, and surprise. It was the perfect killing ground. From the east and the south, the trap closed. Radar stations around Berlin lit up with dense clusters of incoming aircraft. Radios crackled across German command posts as intercept orders were shouted. The Luftwaffe was not scrambling in fragments. It was rising in mass. Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S climbed hard engines, straining pilots, pushing their machines to the edge just to reach altitude in time. For the Americans, there was no illusion of safety. Fuel gauges crept downward with every mile. Escort fighters could not afford to chase recklessly or fight prolonged engagements. Every turn bled energy. Every burst of throttle shortened the journey home. This was not just a battle of guns and wings. It was a calculation measured in minutes, altitude, and fuel. Both sides understood what was about to happen. When the formations finally met, there would be no clean lines or controlled engagements. The sky would collapse into violence. Speed would decide who lived. Discipline would decide who stayed together. And hesitation, even for a second, would decide who never made it out of the sky over Berlin. Only a year earlier, American daylight bombing had bordered on suicide. In 1943, B-17M and B-24S crossed into Germany without fighters that could stay with them. The bombers flew alone, locked into tight formations, trusting altitude and defensive guns to keep them alive. The Luftwaffe tore them apart. Schweinfurt and Regensburg became names whispered in briefing rooms, reminders of how quickly confidence could burn away. German fighter doctrine at the time was ruthless and effective. Interceptors climbed fast, attacked head-on or from above, and broke away before bomber gunners could respond. Veteran pilots struck with precision, then returned again and again. Entire formations were shredded in minutes. For the men inside the bombers, survival depended on luck as much as skill. Losses mounted until the strategy itself was in question. The lesson was brutal but clear. Daylight precision bombing could not continue without true long-range escort. Short-legged fighters could protect bombers part of the way, then turn back, leaving the formations exposed in the most dangerous airspace. The gap over central Germany became known as the killing zone. Every crew that crossed it knew the odds were against them. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force faced a choice: abandon daylight bombing or find a fighter that could go the distance, fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and still bring its pilot home. What followed would change the air war forever, and it would lead directly to the skies over Berlin in March 1944. For the Luftwaffe, the war in the air had begun very differently. In 1939 and 1940, German fighters dominated Europe. Messerschmitt pilots tore through the skies over Poland and France with speed and confidence. Air superiority came quickly, and victory followed on the ground. For a time, the Luftwaffe seemed untouchable, its pilots hardened by constant combat and rapid success. By 1944, that advantage was bleeding away. Years of attrition on the Eastern Front and over Western Europe had drained Germany of its most experienced airmen. Fuel shortages limited training. Factories struggled under bombing. New pilots arrived with only a fraction of the hours once considered necessary for combat. Aircraft still rolled off assembly lines, but skill could not be replaced at the same pace. German air defense doctrine shifted toward desperation. Fighters were no longer free to roam. They were tied to point defense, scrambling to protect cities, factories, and rail hubs. Berlin became the ultimate symbol. If the capital could be defended, morale might survive. If it could be reached in daylight, the illusion of control would collapse. This was the position the Luftwaffe found itself in by March 1944. Still dangerous, still capable of violence, but stretched thin and forced to fight on terms it no longer chose. The hunter that once ruled the skies was now reacting, conserving strength it no longer had, and waiting for a confrontation it could not avoid. The story of the Mustang did not begin in triumph. It began in fear. In 1940, Britain stood alone, facing the real possibility of collapse. The Royal Air Force needed fighters and needed them fast. North American Aviation, a company with little fighter pedigree, offered a bold promise. They would design and deliver an entirely new aircraft in record time. What emerged was unlike anything else in the sky. The Mustang was sleek, efficient, and built around a radical laminar flow wing that reduced drag at high speed. On paper, it was impressive. In practice, early versions powered by the Allison engine fell short where it mattered most. At high altitude, where air combat over Europe was fought, the Mustang struggled. It was fast down low, but above 20,000 feet, it could not compete. The aircraft might have faded into obscurity if not for one decisive change. British engineers saw potential where others saw limits. They replaced the Allison engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the Mustang climbed harder, flew faster, and fought comfortably at bomber altitude. Range, speed, and agility came together in a single airframe. By late 1943, the Mustang was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. For the first time, American bombers had an escort that could follow them all the way to the heart of Germany and fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The balance in the air was beginning to shift, and the pilots on both sides would soon feel the difference. For American pilots, the Mustang was more than a new aircraft. It was a promise. Men who had watched bomber formations return, shredded, now climbed into cockpits with a different mindset. The Mustang felt alive in their hands, light on the control stable, at high speed, and brutally honest in combat. It rewarded discipline and punished hesitation. Technically, the aircraft rewrote the engagement envelope. At altitude, the Merlin engine delivered power where German fighters once held the advantage. The Mustang could climb, dive, and accelerate without surrendering energy. Its .650 caliber machine guns gave it sustained firepower rather than brief cannon bursts. Pilots learned to fight in the vertical, converting altitude into speed and speed into survival. Range changed everything. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany, loiter during combat, and still make the long return to England. This erased the most dangerous gap in the bombing campaign. German fighters could no longer wait until the escorts turned back. Now they had to fight the entire way in. For the Luftwaffe, this was a shock. Engagements that once favored quick strikes now turned into prolonged fights. Mustangs stayed on their tails, followed dives, and climbed back for more. Every loss began to hurt more deeply. The air war was no longer about isolated victories. It had become a war of exhaustion, and Germany was running out of strength. Dawn on March 6, 1944, arrived cold and colorless over English airfields. Frost clung to aluminum skins as bombers stood in long, silent rows. Ground crews moved quickly, checking fuel lines, gun mounts, and control surfaces with numb fingers. Engines had not yet started, but the day already carried weight. Everyone knew where the mission was headed. Inside mess halls, young men ate without appetite. Coffee went untouched. Some joked softly, forcing laughter to break the silence. Others stared at the floor, replaying briefings in their minds. Berlin. The name alone changed the air in the room. This was not another industrial target. This was the capital of the Reich, defended by everything Germany could still put into the sky. Briefing rooms filled with cigarette smoke as maps were unrolled. Red lines cut straight across Germany. Flak zones, rally points, and fighter sweep areas were marked with precision. Commanders spoke calmly, but the message was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe would come in strength. Survival would depend on discipline, timing, and staying together under pressure. Out on the flight line, Mustang pilots walked toward their aircraft with parachutes slung over their shoulders. Names and pin-up art stared back from polished fuselages. Some pilots touched the metal skin before climbing aboard a quiet ritual. Once inside the cockpit, the canopy closed and the world narrowed. There would be no turning back now. Across Germany, radar stations came alive. Operators leaned closer to glowing scopes as dense clusters of signals pushed steadily eastward. There was no mistaking the scale. Phones rang through command posts. Orders were relayed with urgency. Berlin was the target, and the Americans were coming in daylight. The response was immediate. Scramble everything that can fly. At airfields surrounding the capital, engines coughed and roared to life. Messerschmitt Bf-109S and Focke-Wulf 190S lined the runways, some worn from years of combat, others fresh from factories, but flown by inexperienced hands. Pilots pulled on flight gear in silence. A few were veterans with dozens of victories. Many were boys with barely enough hours to survive their first engagement. Climb rates mattered now. Pilots pushed throttles to the stop, watching altimeters spin as they clawed upward. Fuel burned fast. Engines strained under full power. Every minute lost meant the bombers would slip closer to Berlin. Formation discipline tightened as fighters gathered at altitude, waiting for vectors, waiting for the moment to strike. In cockpits across the Luftwaffe, the reality was understood. This was not a patrol. This was a stand. The Americans were escorted deeper than ever before, and turning them back was no longer guaranteed. Ahead, contrails already marked the sky. Two forces were closing fast, carrying the weight of doctrine, technology, and desperation toward the same narrow stretch of air. At 20,000 feet, the sky fractured. American bomber formations droned forward in rigid lines, engines beating in steady rhythm. Above them, Mustangs held position, wings rocking slightly as pilots scanned every sector. Then the calls came over the radio. Dark specks, high and fast, rising from the horizon. Within seconds, shapes sharpened into wings and noses. The Luftwaffe had arrived. German fighters attacked with the sun behind them, diving out of the glare. Tracers flashed as cannon and machine guns opened fire. Bomber gunners swung turrets and squeezed triggers, filling the air with converging streams of lead. The first passes were violent and fast. Aircraft streaked through formations and vanished in seconds, leaving smoke and sudden gaps behind. Mustang pilots broke formation on command. Pairs and fours rolled into dives, trading altitude for speed. Engines screamed as they closed the distance. 50 caliber guns hammered their recoil, shuddering through the airframes. 1 second meant the difference between a clean shot and overshooting into danger. Combat tightened into spirals, vertical climbs, and brutal reversals. Radio traffic exploded. Calls for help overlapped with target reports and warning shouts. Some voices were calm, others cracked under pressure. Parachutes began to appear, white blossoms against the blue. For every aircraft that fell away trailing smoke, another surged into the fight. The sky over Berlin was no longer open space. It had become a battlefield. The moment the formations collided, the sky lost all order. What had been lines and spacing dissolved into raw motion. Fighters slashed through contrails at closing speeds measured in heartbeats. Every direction held danger. There was no longer an up or down, only motion and reaction. Pilots fought inside a shrinking world where survival depended on seconds. Mustang pilots pressed the advantage relentlessly. They attacked from altitude, firing long controlled bursts, then pulled hard into vertical climbs to regain energy. Speed was currency. Waste it and death followed. German fighters answered with violent turns and head-on passes, cannon fire tearing through the air in blinding flashes. One mistake and an aircraft vanished in fire. The bombers endured the worst of it. Cannon shells ripped through aluminum skins, detonating fuel tanks and control systems. Entire aircraft disintegrated mid-air. Gunners fired until barrels glowed, choking on smoke in frozen cabins. Crews fought to hold formation even as wounded men bled onto metal floors and oxygen systems failed. Radio traffic became a storm of voices. Calls for help overlapped with warnings and last reports. Some transmissions ended abruptly. Others never came at all. Parachutes appeared where aircraft had been moments earlier. Below them, burning wreckage spiraled toward the earth. Above, more fighters dove into the chaos. The sky over Germany had become a machine that consumed everything fed into it. As the battle dragged on, the imbalance began to show. German fighters attacked again and again, but each pass cost them precious energy and fuel. Pilots who missed their first firing window rarely got a second chance. The Mustangs stayed with them through dives and climbs, refusing to disengage. What had once been quick interception attacks turned into prolonged fights the Luftwaffe could no longer afford. Inexperience became deadly. Young German pilots dove too steeply, bled speed in tight turns, and failed to break contact. Mustang pilots capitalized instantly. They struck from above, fired, then climbed back into position, repeating the process with cold efficiency. Each mistake removed another aircraft from the fight. Each loss thinned formations that could not be replaced. Desperation followed. Some German pilots pressed attacks far past safe limits, ignoring fuel warnings and engine strain. A few chose head-on passes, trusting cannon fire and nerve to decide the outcome in seconds. Others stayed too long behind bombers exposed to escort fighters that were now everywhere. Survival instincts clashed with orders that demanded sacrifice. The Americans were bleeding too, but differently. Losses hurt, yet formations held. Escort fighters rotated covered gaps and returned to the fight. Discipline kept the structure intact, even as individual aircraft fell away. The system endured where the defense fractured. By midday, the truth was unavoidable. The Luftwaffe was not just losing aircraft, it was losing time pilots and the ability to recover. This was no longer a single engagement. It was the breaking point of an air force pushed beyond its limits, and the sky over Berlin was bearing witness to its collapse. As the battle entered its final phase, desperation took full control. The Luftwaffe no longer attacked in organized waves. Individual fighters and broken elements charged forward wherever they saw an opening. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Engines ran hot and unstable after hours at maximum power. Pilots knew they were fighting on borrowed minutes, yet they pressed on, driven by orders and the knowledge that Berlin lay just below them. With ammunition depleted and formations shattered, some German pilots chose extreme measures. Head-on attacks became more frequent. Closing speeds exceeded anything human reflexes were built to manage. When guns failed or firing windows vanished, collisions followed. Aircraft struck bombers with violent finality, tearing both machines apart in explosions that lit the sky and sent fragments tumbling through the air. Below the main engagement, the consequences multiplied. Crippled fighters staggered downward, trailing fire and smoke. Bombers with shattered wings struggled to hold altitude before slipping into slow spirals. Parachutes appeared sporadically, then in growing numbers. Some opened cleanly and drifted in silence. Others failed entirely, their pilots vanishing without witness. On the ground, civilians watched in stunned disbelief. Pieces of aircraft fell into fields, forests, and villages. Burning wreckage carved scars into the countryside. Bodies followed metal and fabric from the sky, turning the air battle into something brutally personal for those below. The war was no longer distant or abstract. It was raining down upon them. By early afternoon, the sky itself seemed exhausted. Smoke smeared the horizon in dark streaks. The roar of engines faded as surviving aircraft disengaged and turned away. What remained was an eerie calm, broken only by distant fires and falling debris. The battle for Berlin's airspace was ending, leaving behind a graveyard measured not in miles of land, but in altitude and loss. When the surviving aircraft finally turned away from Berlin, the scale of the loss became clear. More than 100 German fighters had been destroyed in a single day. Among them were pilots who had survived years of combat, men whose experience could not be replaced by hurried training or fresh machines. For the Luftwaffe, these were not just losses. They were wounds that would never heal. American losses were heavy as well. Mustangs lay broken across the German countryside. Bombers failed to return their crew's loss somewhere between fire and the earth below. Survivors who parachuted down were taken prisoner, entering a different kind of battle that would last until the war's end. Victory had come, but it carried weight that followed every man back to England. On the ground in Berlin, the damage was unmistakable. Rail yards burned. Factories were torn open. Smoke rose from neighborhoods already scarred by years of war. Civilians emerged from shelters shaken by a new reality. The capital of the Reich had been struck in daylight under escort, despite every effort to stop it. Inside Germany, the truth spread quietly. Propaganda claimed success and heroism, but airfields told another story. Hangars stood emptier. Familiar faces were missing. New pilots arrived to fill cockpits already known as graves. Confidence eroded with every unanswered question about how this had been allowed to happen. Strategically, the meaning was undeniable. The bombers had reached Berlin and returned. The escorts had held. The Luftwaffe had thrown its strength into the sky and lost irreplaceable men in return. From this point forward, Germany's air defense would fight on borrowed time, and the balance of the air war had shifted beyond recovery. The battle over Berlin did not end the air war, but it changed it forever. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe was no longer the force it once had been. Aircraft would still be built. Squadrons would still take off. But the core was gone. The veteran pilots who had carried German air power from triumph to triumph were now scattered across the fields and forests of central Germany. For the Americans, the lesson was just as clear. Daylight bombing, once a gamble bordering on disaster, had become a sustained campaign. The Mustang had proven it could escort bombers into the deepest heart of the Reich fight through overwhelming opposition and still bring pilots home. Confidence replaced doubt. Doctrine hardened into certainty. As 1944 war on Allied aircraft would range almost at will across German skies. Oil plants burned, rail networks collapsed. Factories struggled to recover. The Luftwaffe fought on, but always on the defensive, always short of fuel pilots and time. The moment when Germany might have regained control of the air had passed over Berlin in March. For the men who flew that day, memory carried two truths: pride and loss. Mustang pilots remembered the power of their aircraft and the moment they realized the enemy could no longer escape them. They also remembered empty bunks and unanswered roll calls. German survivors remembered courage and fear, mixed together, and the instant they understood the sky no longer belonged to them. History would remember the battle as more than a clash of machines. It was a test of adaptation and endurance. One Air Force learned faster, protected its people, and mastered the environment. The other fought with determination, but ran out of what mattered most. On that day over Berlin, the balance of the air war shifted permanently, and the Mustang became not just a fighter, but a symbol of how the skies were finally won. Long after the engines fell silent, the sky over Berlin remembered the battle. Contrails' faded smoke drifted, and the empty air returned to stillness. But for the men who fought there, the silence never truly came. They carried it with them, etched into memory by fire, fear, and moments measured in seconds. This was not a victory defined only by numbers or wreckage. It was defined by adaptation. One side learned faster, protected its people, and reshaped the rules of the fight. The other fought with courage and resolve, but ran out of what no factory could replace: experience, time, lives. On that day, the future of the air war chose its direction. History would later reduce it to dates and statistics. But above Berlin, in March 1944, it was something far more human. It was young men trusting machines and each other at 20,000 feet. It was the moment when courage, discipline, and innovation converged. And when it ended, the skies of Europe would never belong to Germany again.